Our Poets and Scholars Roundtable has been assembled to respond to some of the many themes in Marilyn Hacker's long career, including formalism, sexualities, feminism, translation, community, and poetries of witness. So some of the questions that we thought might be interesting to consider in this relation are, what is your working definition of poetic form, of poetic formalism? Are they different, and if so, how? Form and formalism. What is the relationship between your practice as a poet and issues of form? How do you make formal decisions? What have been your major artistic, intellectual, and cultural influences? Do issues of race, gender, sexuality, other identity issues come into play with your formal choices? Do such issues influence your participation in poetic communities? How has translation, either between languages or more metaphorically, come into play in your work or in your career? What, if anything, is the poet's relationship to or responsibility to witness world events, such as war, dislocation, disaster, oppression? How do you negotiate this relationship in your own work? Who are your audiences? Are they different for different artistic projects? How do you negotiate moving among them? How does your work as a critic or poet inform your? How does your work as a critic inform your work as a poet, and/or vice versa, if you do also work as a critic or translator? That should be enough to get us started. So I think we'll just go down the row here. So, can we start with you or no?
I wish not to go first.
Valerie, do you feel ready to lead off?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Hey.
All right. So I'm going to keep an eye on the time, Valerie, and if we get to 10 minutes, I'll give you a little wave. Okay?
Thank you so much for being here. Can you all hear me if I just project rather than, okay, because I can project. So I just want to thank Lisa and everybody and all the students and everybody who's helped to set this up. It's just been great and really well organized. And thank all of you for being here. So I'm going to cheat a little bit by starting with two short poems that I'm in dialogue with. That was the question, to start with two poems that we're in dialogue with. And so one is part 7 from a poem by Adrienne Rich, Cartographies of Silence, from her book, The Dream of a Common Language, which is a book that's been my companion for such a long time.
Definitely.
It was an old theme, even for me. Language cannot do everything. Chalk it on the walls where the dead poets lie in their mausoleums. If, at the will of the poet, the poem could turn into a thing of granite, flank laid bare, a lifted head alight with dew. If it could simply look you in the face with naked eyeballs, not letting you turn till you and I, who long to make this thing, were finally clarified together in its stare. And then a poem in translation by Paul Celan. Your hand full of hours, you came to me and I said, your hair is not brown. So you lifted it lightly onto the scales of grief. It weighed more than I. On ships they come to you and make it their cargo, then put it on sale in the markets of lust. You smile at me from the depth. I weep at you from the scale that stays light. I weep. Your hair is not brown. They offer brine from the sea and you give them curls. You whisper, they're filling the world with me. Now, in your heart, I'm a hollow way still. You say, lay the leafage of years beside you. It's time you came closer and kissed me. The leafage of years is brown. Your hair is not brown. And then a read from one of my poems. This is a book-length poem. A lot going on, a collage, in part about the women of Juarez. I'm going to start with part 24, so we're about a third of the way into the book. And you don't need to worry about following one narrative because there's just many things happening at once. Valentin Fuentes, Ignacio Mejia, Vicente Guerrero, Juan Gabriel, Avenida Carlos Amaya. The streets of Juárez, muscular lock and grid. On Avenida Lerdo, between Ignacio Mejia and Avenida 16 de Septiembre, the bridal district. Handmade gowns, 50% off. The bodice is corset-like, exquisite, intricately adorned with tiny roses stitched by little hands. The plant manager calls them his beauty queens. Nearly all of the victims were poor, young and slender, with dark flowing hair and warm reddish-brown complexions. This way. I wake to exhaust smell, forehead numb on the window. At left, the reservation unfolds in pink hills, new tract homes, gleaming yellow playground equipment. We dip into the canyon where the orange flag stiffens violently with wind. North toward the neon-trimmed San Felipe Casino, past the parking lot, post-night shift, watching her wrestle with air, coat and uniform ripping away, pushing a path to her car. On the road between Cuautitlan and Tlatelolco, 57-year-old Juan Diego, day laborer, maker of mats, meets the Blessed Mother Virgin Mary of Guadalupe. Juanito Juan, Dieguito, Juancin, my little son. Spills from his tilma Castilian roses. Says, through me, thorn and red petal, believe this. The first I encounter are the Sibyls, those women chosen by God to prophesy the principal mysteries of our faith. A woman like Minerva, daughter of the first Jupiter and mistress over all the wisdom of Athens. I see Apollo Argentaria, who helped Lucan, her husband, write his epic Pharsalia. I see the daughter of the divine Tiresias, more learned than her father. I see Zenobia, queen of the Palmyrans, as wise as she was valiant. And Arete, most learned daughter of Aristippus. A Nicostrata, framer of Latin verses and most erudite in Greek. An Aspasia of Miletus, who taught philosophy and rhetoric, and who was a teacher of the philosopher Pericles. An Hypatia, who taught astrology and studied many years in Alexandria. A Leontium, a Greek woman who questioned the philosopher Theophrastus and convinced him. A Jusia, a Corinna, a Cornelia, and finally a great throng of women deserving to be named, some as Greeks, some as muses, some as seers, for all were nothing more than learned women held and celebrated. Jessica Lizalda Leon, March 14th, 1993. Lorenza Isela Gonzalez, April 24th, 1994. Erika Garcia Morena, July 16th, 1995. Sonia Yvette Ramirez, August 10th, 1996. Juana Iñiguez Mares, October 23rd, 1997. Perla Patricia Sáenz Diaz, February 19th, 1998. Berta Luz Briones Palacios, August 2nd, 1999. Amparo Guzman, April 2nd, 2000. Gloria Rivas Martínez, October 28th, 2001. Lourdes Yvette Lucero Campos, January 19th, 2002. Miriam Soledad Sáenz Acosta, March 28, 2003. No two sisters more unlike than us. Cheerleader, chubby recluse, the dragged-down hair-pulling fights. At night, holding the wooden handles of a jump rope, bed to bed. Hold tight, you said, between us. Amalia went back to Juarez. Dirt floors, sheets for doors, Coca-Cola in small bottles in wood crates stacked, bundles of tortillas and tamales out the front window, pesos and dollar bills crushed on the ledge. We say proudly, 2 refrigerators, unlike anyone in the neighborhood. What is a domesticated woman? A female of the species? The one explanation is as good as another. A woman is a woman. She only becomes a domestic, a wife, a chattel, a Playboy bunny, a prostitute, or a human dictaphone in certain relations. A typical Maki work schedule, 60 hours per week. Typical daily wage, $8.29. Weekly salary, $49.74. Deduction for union dues, 4%. Net weekly pay, $47.74. Typical shared rent or contribution to family income, $45.71. Amount left over per week for food, clothes, shoes, and medical attention, $2.03. After the late shift, on the Maki bus, we stitch ourselves one to another, take the middle seats. No decimos nada y no miramos. Nos cosemos. Some job applications ask women if they are pregnant or sexually active, and, if so, what kind of contraceptives they use and when they last menstruated. Some workers are turned away for being as little as 3 minutes late, begin and end their night shifts without security or protective assistance. The missive from the Attorney General of the state of Chihuahua. You parents for raising up daughters whose conduct does not conform to the moral order. After all, it's very hard to go out in the street when it's raining and not get wet. So there's a lot of questions to answer. So I just want to briefly just kind of talk about one, which is about form. And I think when we use the word form in terms of poetry, we think of it in a very narrow sense, right? We tend to think of formal poems, a sonnet or a haiku. But really form applies to all poetry, whether it's free verse or formal in the sense of having metrics or syllabics, which all poems do in some ways. But I think of form a little bit differently than that strict definition, which is to think of it like the body. Or like any living system. A poem is like a living system or an ecosystem in some ways. So whatever kind of poem you're writing, it is a body that needs to move, right? And just like we each have a body, there is a kind of coordination and cooperation or concert that happens. And that's mediated by many things, right? If you have an injury, then the body tries to compensate or does compensate in some ways. And I really do think of poetry as that kind of thing. So as a writer, when I'm making a poem or revising a poem, if I'm not applying some sort of form with the name, like iambic pentameter or something like that, it doesn't mean that I'm not making decisions as a poet constantly in terms of what kind of organic system the whole poem has to have. And there are no strict rules for me in terms of free verse. But it's very on my mind constantly when I revise a poem, if not when I'm writing it, about how the poem is moving as one body or a kind of living ecosystem of the sound, the rhythm, the images, and those things. And I'll just make a leap quickly is to this idea of witnessing, because Each and Her is a poem that makes an effort to witness something that's just really brutal to to take in, right? So we're now anywhere the numbers from 500 to almost 900 documented murders of women in Juarez. And the way they've documented that group is because of similarities in those murders. So it doesn't account for every murder of a woman. There are more than those. And like the body, we move through the world as a witness. I think it's hard to live your life. You have to turn off the witnessing mechanism, I think, right, in the world. I mean, and we tend to do that, all of us. We'll turn away from things. But if you move through the world as a body, you are constantly witnessing the world, right? Whether it's with your eyes or your emotion or your intuition. So I think not witnessing is an effort, but I would say that we do that all the time, to turn away. But I think the natural impulse, like the poem's body witnesses, is for us to witness the world. And the practice of witnessing, whether it's desire or suffering or work, demands a kind of reckoning, right? Moving through the world every day, does it not, demands a kind of conscious or subconscious reckoning with what we see around us. And to do this, to write this book, I had to maybe perhaps remove some of the ways in which I protected myself from some things that were the most difficult things to write about. It wasn't an accomplishment, it was more of a decision that I was gonna maybe not look right at something, but try to keep my eye on a subject that was hard to look at. So for me, marrying the idea that the poem is by its nature a body that witnesses, I by my nature is a body that witnesses, means that I have to come to a kind of reckoning to write about this particular subject.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I want to thank everybody for having me here, Lisa and the university, and just to be here with all these amazing poets. It's really something. I feel very grateful. I'll start with, there were so many amazing questions, and I'll start also with a poem that has influenced me. It was hard to think about, to sort of figure out who to talk about. There are all these people, but I rested on James Schuyler, partially because, like Asa Berg, who I read in the Plaza, he was kind of a late love, you know. I came to him a little bit later, and so it's been like a torrid love affair. And so, and this is this poem called This Dark Apartment. Coming from the deli a block away today, I saw the UN building shine. And in all the months and years I've lived in this apartment I took so you and I would have a place to meet, I never noticed that it was in my view. I remember very well the morning I walked in and found you in bed with X. He dressed and left. You dressed too. I said, stay 5 minutes. You did. You said, that's the way it is. It was not much of a surprise. Then X got on speed and ripped off an antique chest and an air conditioner, etc. After he was gone and you had changed the Siegel lock, I asked you on the phone, can't you be content with your wife and me? I'm not built that way, you said. No surprise. Now, without saying why, you've let me go. You don't return my calls, who used to call me almost every evening when I lived in the country. Hasn't he told you why? No, and I doubt he ever will. Goodbye. It's mysterious and frustrating. How I wish you would come back. I could tell you how, when I lived on East 49th, first with Frank and then with John, we had a lovely view of the UN building and the Beekman Towers. They were not my lovers, though. You were. You said so. Right? Like, that is an adult poem. I'm really in the mood lately for adult literature, and that is an adult. That turn, right? And that moment, then we talk about form and grammar, but that moment where we're looking, right? First with Frank and John. I think we know who that Frank and that John are. And a lovely view of the UN building and the Beekman Towers. They were not my lovers, though. And how grammar does this thing where, right, it could be the tower, like landscape could be the lovers. No, but it's though, they were not my lovers, though. You were. And then how we as poets make a choice to say, you said so, right? That's the adult, you said so. The moment in which we like are most childlike, like you said so, you know, like. Oh. I'll read a new poem from this crazy new project, and then I'll read one older poem, and then talk a brief essay. Do you remember if the Clit Club was on Friday or Saturday? I can't remember. Right. That's what Brenda Shaughnessy said too. She like yelled out of the audience. I digress. I think Meat was on Friday. And it was for the boys. And Clit Club was on Saturday for the girls. I guess I should say men and women, but I was so young then that I didn't really think about that sort of thing. And one did feel young over there in that darkness. I remember you could watch girl-on-girl porn downstairs, not the kind I found in my father's drawer when I was looking for the remote control, though I watched that too, but rough-cut, grainy dyke porn, which isn't so much for me anymore, but does have its charms and certainly is something closer to real. Though I don't know if it was real, if real was what I was looking for at the Clit Club. It all sort of felt like a movie, standing downstairs watching the girls fuck on the screen, doing things I really hadn't done yet, standing and watching and feeling my friend tap my shoulder and say she'd be back in a bit. The way the girl standing next to her would sort of look at me for a second, and I'd feel a bit shy. Do you remember the Clit Club? There was a stage where butch girls would dance like go-go boys. I remember standing with my friends, watching this short-haired woman in her baseball cap, t-shirt, and boxers that were packed, and how the girls with long hair and short skirts would get on the stage and get down on their knees. I watched her put her hand in their long hair and hold their gaze before the girls would bend their heads and pretend. I was still trying to figure it all out. What went on in small bathrooms when my friends went inside? I knew what I imagined happened, but really it was a mystery to me. I realized that that's also somehow my tribute to In the Waiting Room. I had this little moment where I was like, oh, from the sound from next door. It's not my aunt, it's me. She's great, Elizabeth Bishop. Richard Howard said that she had him over to her house one time, and she like walked him through the house, opening all these closet doors, and went, closets everywhere. This is from this is from my first book, or my second book. This is called Acknowledgement, 1964, which takes its name from the John Coltrane, the portion of A Love Supreme, but Acknowledgement, 1964. Could have gone west, could have packed your things, who cares that you weren't old enough to drive? Could have sold yourself to truckers and highwaymen, could have gone down the dark road between home and somewhere better. The whole world watching TV and no one thinking of you. Could have got lost, could have said, I don't know, when the waitress asked, where you live at? You could have lied and said New Jersey or Mobile. Of course, that assumes you'd get past Mason-Dixon. You could have seen battlefields, Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, even Chicago if you waded deep enough into summer. Could have slept with your head on the ground like your sister, her ear to the transistor, listening to, I want to hold your hand. You could have said, fuck the Beatles, and left them behind, shooting the lights out of every stadium, every coliseum. You could have made the girls scream because you were the stranger under the bleachers, that ember of the cigarette burning in the darkness just outside their porch light's glow. You could have named them Helen, Rochelle, Ida Mae, and in Texas, Irene Rosenberg, a girl just as lonely as you. Imagine, you're leaving before it ever got started. Where's that girl you married? You don't know. You were halfway to Billings or Provo or Bend. You watched the cities of the Midwest burn. You threw bottles and never cut your hair. Remember the drum kit in Schlesinger's Instruments? How you crawled through the broken window and banged away in the shards of that city. If they could have seen you then, all muscle and heart, sweating, no more stupid melody holding you back. Just the bass line, just the gas line hissing, and your foot on the pedal. You could have gotten away. The country was different. A boy could walk without getting beaten beyond an inch of his life, without getting lashed to a fence in God-forsaken Wyoming. Why, God hadn't forsaken Wyoming or Birmingham yet. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner safe in their beds. Perhaps you passed by them. You could have passed me by and saved yourself the whole mess. My mother doesn't know you yet. She's on her back in the grass with some other man's son. That's my father's favorite poem in America. I was trying to think about how to answer all of these questions in front of all these poets who I admire so much, and all of you who I admire so much as well, all you poets. And so I thought that what I would do is I would write a letter to Tim Riggins, who, for any of you who watch Friday Night Lights, he is a football player on that show, and it says something also about the question about my range of influence. And I think that for those of you who haven't watched it, I do actually think it's one of the great artistic statements of the last 5 years. Yeah, although I would like to talk privately with Lila Garrity. Dear Tim Riggins, when I was little, I was a boy just like you. Or I wanted to be a boy just like you. Actually, the boy I wanted to be was named Keith. And he was in high school, but he rode the bus with us little kids because his girlfriend Candy's mom drove the bus. They'd be sitting on the bus by the time all of us got on, so we'd get to walk past them. Candy would spend the whole bus ride sitting on Keith's lap. I wanted to know what it felt like to have a girl sit on my lap like that. You look confused. I was little, but somehow I knew already. But what do you do with a knowing like that? My grandmother tucked me in at night and I said, Nanny, you know when you dream and there's a boy and a girl and they're kissing? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, in the dream, I'm the boy. The space between her pausing and tucking me in that night and saying, next time, try being the girl, is, I think, the first time I made a form, which is to say, it is the first time I made a boundary around myself that could contain all of the silences and all of the unspeakable feelings of what it was to be the girl who was the boy kissing the girl in the dream. When I say unspeakable, I don't mean just terrible, though sometimes it was that. I mean something that literally moves beyond or is larger than language. I mean the white space on the page that pressures the poem. Or even take your playbook. You know how there's more white space than actually plays written down? I bet when you look at it, you can see those plays before you've made it out on the field. I bet you can hear the bodies hitting each other and hear everyone screaming. I bet you can see Lila Garrity running onto the field. How do you make language for something like that? A language for the girl who runs onto the field but won't kiss you until everyone's gone home. That's how a form gets born. I know it doesn't seem like it when you sit in class and the teacher goes on about Shakespeare and makes it like so much math, this foot, that foot, iambic. I didn't get it either for the longest time. God bless the people who've been good students their whole lives. I was not that one. I remember sitting in class at college after I'd gotten out of that rural town and my teacher asking me to scan a line of a sonnet and then asking if I was dyslexic. She said she'd never seen anyone with such a good ear get scansion so wrong. In that conversation, I also learned the word fluke and savant. But I wasn't either. I was waiting for the right coach. And when I found him, Ken Fields told me to put my hand on my chest and feel my heartbeat, and then make that sound with my hand on the desk, and mark when I heard that sound in the poem, and then mark when it didn't make that sound in the poem. And that's how I learned not to just write a sonnet, but to love a sonnet. That's when I learned that the villanelle was the thing I'd been doing my whole life, working the same thought over. How do I find her? Some teachers are going to tell you that that's the dumbest thing ever. But let me tell you, Tim, I think maybe those folks didn't grow up like us. Tim, you can find form in the most amazing places. On the roof of the car at my grandparents' drive-in the empty bookstore I worked in as the mills shut down, under the High Line, inside the Clit Club, sitting with my teacher Richard Howard and blushing as he said, "Why do you break the line like you do? Because it feels good?" Let me tell you something. All the while his French bulldog humping my leg. Yes, because it feels good. And then I learned why it felt good. Form, like all good things, takes practice, patience, and someone more experienced than you. If you had told me all those years ago that I'd be here in Texas talking about form and teaching young poets, I had said you were nuts. But here I am. I've got to go and answer a bunch of questions about influence and audience and poetic communities. Thanks for helping me think this through. I'll tell you, there was a moment when we were driving to Texas where the sky got so big, my partner and I could see the sunset in all four directions. The orange of the western sky we were leaving, purple to the south, slate blue in the north, and towards you, it was practically dark already. For the millionth time, I thought, how can I even try to make sense of that? And who would I tell anyway? Tim, that's why I moved towards form, because something's got to help me bring the good news. So that's a little bit of something. Oh. That's what you do when you're so nervous.
Okay.
Wow. It's kind of hard to follow the Clit Club in Friday Night Lights.
I think you can do it.
I think I can. I'm going to start by talking about my process, which is a little bit unusual, and then I'll get into the poems. As my hero poet, Federico Garcia Lorca, once said, "Only mystery allows us to live. Only mystery." I'd add to Lorca's dictum, only mystery allows us to live and to grow. Vis-a-vis growth, I find my poetry is consistently 2 years ahead of my mundane self. So I've learned to pay attention, sometimes like a fog-bound Sherlock Holmes, to its lures and messages. Whatever my work might signify to the public or my readers, for my part, my verse is a relentless and tireless mirror, an indispensable tool for self-revelation. Usually by the time a volume is published, and my new book is coming out in a month, I have a much firmer grasp of the why of the book and the place the poems occupy in the meaningful arc of my entire life. The gist of the poetry effectively points me toward my deepest obsessions, fears, strivings, and authentic self. The poems are invariably wiser than everyday Cyrus. I'm an unusual poet in that I work almost exclusively in book-length cycles, and it often takes several years for the full theme of the cycle to emerge, which can be both frustrating and exhilarating in terms of the dogged detective work and kind of ever-expanding odyssey that's involved. I've hardly ever written an occasional poem. I wish that wasn't true, but it is true for me. I seem to require length and structure as a poet. I do have lyric impulses, but they're always linked to usually like a far-ranging project. I'm a world citizen, an inveterate traveler, so crafting my thematic books usually involves actual travel and pilgrimage and investigation and cultural and historical study. I'm consistently drawn to the past, to places of trauma, and to stories of hard-won spiritual triumph and spiritual endurance. I'm also a professional actor, and my written work has something of a mediumistic quality. I seldom write from the perspective of Cyrus, and I often take on the personae of other people, ideally without appropriation or exploitation, but with true identification and in most respect. This chameleon impulse is very much how I live. I readily whisk past the usual social and individual boundaries to explore the psychologies and predicaments of my poetic speakers. My life and poetry are centered in an active and purposeful notion of empathy and identification. So empathy is at the heart of my work as a writer. I'd like to read a poem by Francesc Parcerisas, who's the Catalan poet I've been translating, and then read a poem in response to that. This was a poem he wrote in response to Bosnia. It's called Then, Aleshores in Catalan, Then. Then with her hands, she'd crown her son's head. Then with her arms, she'd embrace him. Then with her fingers, she'd pluck out his eyes. Then with her teeth, she'd gnaw his liver. Then with motherly claws, she'd shred his memories. Then with her nipples, she'd nourish him on the milk of hatred. Then with her tongue, she'd insist, Lord, Lord, I'm only doing this for love, because you pledged that this bread is your body and this wine your blood. And in response to that, I'm going to read the opening poem of my new book. I'll just read a couple parts of it. It's called Pencil and Dragon Slayer, and this part has to do with Hitler. And this section is called There Are No Children Here. So I'm interested in like the religious reasons for violence and the vision that fuels war and jingoism. There are no children here. Adolf, the upending dreamer. He was a rebuffed painter, let me remind you. And when his acolytes insisted, alluding to their burlike camps, Es gibt hier keine Kinder, there are no children here, it was unalloyed truth in one sense. A kid cast off, I was relegated to the shadow of their vision of heaven. And no Valhalla-bound heart, no dream-laden easel, no lofty fanatic ever admits ensuing cries of failed infants. The first act of the play, the last. The first gazebo, the first garden lamp. The first busyness glimpsed in the earliest park. And no words to pin them yet. No handles for this fleeting vision. Baled hay, waving hands, bits of blue spied from a chink in a boxcar. A wick-thin boy bearing his numbered flesh become the shadow of their vision of heaven. And I'll read one other short poem from this new book. It's called The Crossed Out Swastika, and it's about young people in World War II. This one is called Three Kings, keeping the religious theme there. Three kings, when my belittled village was eclipsed by pillaging soldiers. Quick as a windblown kite, my baking aunt coaxed me into her privy's acrid underworld. Banished from the flower-dusted blossoms of her apron, I was too green to beseech God or beautiful Queen Esther. Unmoored, I fastened on the bookish name of my slingshot, Aramis, Aramis, Aramis. As if in that shit-drenched dark, I could summon abracadabra, the slingshot's Y-shaped trusty wood. And from that musketeer mantra, I acquired a little certainty, a little stamina, a little consolation, like 3 resplendent kings come to a filthy manger.
Thank you, everyone, and hello. I'll also begin by a little story, and maybe I'll. I decided one day to read the what is written in the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetics on Arabic poetry and poetics. And when it came to discussing meter, if you will, or prosody, there was one phrase there that caught my attention, which is Arabic poetry's traditional prosody is based on, it's accentual, it's not as in English, syllabic, if you will. And so there was this phrase in there that said, and I'm paraphrasing perhaps, that they hadn't yet come to the concept of the syllabus. And I remember, of course, being very pissed reading that. And the ironic part is that a couple of years later, I was asked by somebody to see if I had any comments, because they were doing the new edition of the Princeton Encyclopedia on that. So I wrote a little brief response on Arabic poetics, prosody, and so forth. And I argued in it that, well, I didn't say this precisely, that Noam Chomsky notwithstanding, the idea that that language is somehow now a fixed idea with the syllable. We start with the syllable, and everything that's accentual is somehow from another time, is both scientifically unproven, and not to mention culturally hegemonous. And so with that, I would like to say that I grew up with the rhythms of Arabic poetry and Arabic meter in my ears. I was just discussing with Marilyn how I asked my dad, for instance, why did he choose to name my sister so-and-so, Lemise is her name. And he recited to me an ancient classic, 1,000 years old poetry line that has the name as the beloved of the. And so when I came into English, and when I came into translation or my own poetry in English, it was always this bizarre experience that what translates in my mind is an echo. And I would like, of course, in a delusional state, think that it's a universal echo of sound in the human cortex. And I may be right and I may be wrong. And everybody will get up in arms about losing the specifications of the particular languages. Well, here in this language we do this, and here in that language they do that. And these are things not to be belittled. But I also wonder, how did the pentameter or the iambic foot come about? In Arabic, the idea of the Arabic prosody was only discovered after the fact. It was actually consciousness, human consciousness, that took something that humans, for some reason, in that particular realm, found very natural without applying science to it. And only hundreds of years later, if not more, some Arab linguist scholar came and said, well, I'm gonna tell you what Arabic poetry is about. Here's our poetry. And then it got stuck, and nobody could step out of those bounds of what constitutes poetry in the human mind for a particular regional, for a particular language or people. And I imagine the same happened in English. And I remember reading something by Miroslav Holub saying that, well, his theory, or maybe he heard it from somebody, is that the pentameter line is basically as long as your breath can hold, going back to your heartbeat and so forth. And it's fascinating because in the end we're not going to know, and it will be a long time before we know. And I wonder if part of what broke form free, so to speak, in the modern time is the idea that we are still, in a Jackson Pollock way of looking at things, simply more open to nature forms as opposed to the problematic term of received forms. So that's really all I have to say about that. So I'll read a short poem by Mahmoud Darwish. I want from love only the beginning. And here we go. I want from love only the beginning. The pigeons darn this day's dress over my Granada squares. There's a lot of wine in the jars for a feast after us. There are enough windows in the songs for pomegranate blossoms to explode. I leave the Arabian jasmine in the vase. I leave my little heart in my mother's closet. I leave my dream laughing in water. I leave the dawn in the honey of figs. I leave my day and my yesterday in the alleyways to the orange plaza where the pigeons fly. Was I the one who descended to your feet for speech to rise as a white moon in your night's milk? Stomp the air for me to see the street of the flute blue. Stomp the evening for me to see how marble falls ill between me and you. The windows are empty of your shawl's gardens. In a different time, I used to know a lot about you and pick gardenias off your 10 fingers. In a different time, I had pearls around your neck and a name on a ring illuminating darkness. I want from love only the beginning. The pigeons flew over the sky's last ceiling. The pigeons flew and flew. A lot of wine will remain after us in the jars, and a bit of land is enough for us to meet and for peace to arrive. So, and then I'm going to read this poem of mine called Luke, Cool Hand, I'm Your Father. And briefly, I'll say that this is a form that I've stumbled on recently, which is based on the modern fidgeting of the text message. And this is for the one I hug. Luke, cool hand, I'm your father. Nurturing people into junkies, par for the course, pills and fear and salt and sugar and grease at the dollar store. They did have a choice. Softly killing them softly at consumerist rates. Science isn't final on a few points. If you want to smear, smear. Just don't misconstrue me. I get paid well for it. And poets who get paid as much, wholly we listen to them. Don't get all che on me, chérie. My patients, as if I own them, as long as they're nothing but patience. And they me, of course. They are called lives. This life loved you. That one got you a newsboy cap, gift card for fancy steak, or asked you to her house or funeral. In tyranny, there's also love, as gesture, and as such, compassion is easy, a deductible or copay, or who do this calling. We anoint you demigod, a who's who club. As for mass murder, it doesn't need to occur acutely in order for it to be that. It's not the hell one enters, but the hell one enters others into and also enters. Then I'll read another poem of mine called The Very Hungry Caterpillar. Speaking of translation and rhythms and what have you. After gluttony, the insatiable rain drowns the earth, and all the ruins remain, cannot be finished off. You climb up to the highest post, a lemon tree. You become visible, suspected at first of being bird excrement, its odd landing. Visible through the kitchen window of all who can dislocate you from a leaf to the concrete with a twig, and unsure what you believe when jabbed, when your red-horned tongue flashes out of your grotesque head. I poke, you writhe, a green juice oozes out of you, the color of the earth you ravaged. Mint and thyme. The next day, the sun. The rest of your clan, a festival on branches. Your cranium, a wharf's. Your future, a swallowtail. Thank you. And also I think it's, for me, the real question is when the I moves not into another singular pronoun, but into the plural. And as Michael Palmer once told me, every we is schizophrenic. And so, and schizophrenics have their own narcissism too, so. Mimesis. My daughter wouldn't hurt a spider that had nested between her bicycle handles. For 2 weeks, she waited until it left of its own accord. If you tear down the web, I said, it will simply know this isn't a place to call home, and you'd get to go biking. She said, that's how others become refugees, isn't it? Blue fly. Translation also is a process of persona. And I say that because the name of one of the famous 1500 years ago, a warrior poet in Arabic who wrote one of those things called mu'allakas, which is the poems that were suspended in people's memories and on the walls of the Kaaba and whatever. His name was Antara, and when I looked up what his name meant in an ancient Arabic dictionary, it meant blue fly, which, you know, big blue flies, they're believed mythically to be jinn, blue fly. You dream of a pony. You have a fear of flies, house flies, horse flies, green flies, you name it. There was a famous warrior poet once, his name was Blue Fly. Perhaps because that's the most elusive kind of jinn, blue jinn. And I remembered you as spears quenched their thirst in me and swords gleamed as white as your smile. Except you are staring at a colossal fly poised on the bench while the trainer places a blue bicycle helmet on your head for the pony ride, and you ask, how is this going to protect me from the fly? The trainer calmly replies, last week I rode an Arabian horse for 500 miles and was all right. But you can't believe it, traveling all that distance while swatting at flies.
This is called Glowing Stick. I'm probably now and always was a real and complete idiot. One lies on its back by the bed, glowing stick, a wand to shave my head, to call, to paste my hybridity onto. What is it thus? A meaning of a meeting of a meeting? I say a kiss. The stripes are enormous, day and night, and we like the enormity of fucking love, the impossible words that leave us on our platforms in the sun, spinning. I want to be on a beach with you too, a beach on Mars. There was a woman I claimed I would be dead with if I couldn't have her alive, and you are greater than either in this synapse. You float in going, what? The tiny stick goes orange and then not. You can't even see us because we're everything else and it's ours, and I love you in the blind spot of our changing ages. I mean, there are certain poems that it's like, you've read them so many times and you've thought about them so many times and you've used them in teaching so many times that you feel like you wrote them, and there's nothing, there's that strange experience when usually when a poet friend dies, but it's become increasingly popular when somebody's alive, that a book party is us all standing up and reading their work, and what that sensation is of putting somebody else's work on. But this work that it's sort of like, it feels like your shirt, you borrow your friend's shirt and you're like, this is mine, this one. And so this is, it's called Transcription of Organ Music, and it's the quiet poem from Howell. But I think it did a lot of things that haunted me when I was young, and they still haunt me. And the title, of course, is maybe the most important part. The flower in the glass peanut bottle, formerly in the kitchen, crooked to take a place in the light. The closet door opened because I used it before. It kindly stayed open, waiting for me, its owner. I began to feel my misery and palate on floor, listening to music. My misery, that's why I want to sing. The room closed down on me. I expected the presence of the Creator. I saw my gray painted walls and ceiling. They contained my room. They contained me. As the sky contained my garden, I opened my door. The rambler vine climbed up the cottage post, the leaves in the night still where the day had placed them, the animal heads of the flowers where they had arisen to think of the sun. Can I bring back the words? Will thought of transcription haze my mental open eye? The kindly search for growth, the gracious desire to exist of the flowers, my near ecstasy at existing among them, the privilege to witness my existence, you too must seek the sun. My books piled up before me for my use, waiting in space where I placed them. They haven't disappeared. Time's left its remnants and qualities for me to use. My words piled up, my text, my manuscripts, my loves. I had a moment of clarity, saw the feeling in the heart of things, walked out to the garden crying, saw the red blossoms in the night light, sun's gone, they had all grown. In a moment, and were waiting, stopped in time for the day sun to come and give them. Flowers, which as in a dream at sunset, I watered faithfully, not knowing how much I loved them. I am so lonely in my glory, except they too out there. I looked up, those red bush blossoms beckoning and peering in the window, waiting in the blind love. Their leaves too have hope and are upturned top flat to the sky to receive, all creation open to receive the flat earth itself. The music descends, as does the tall bending stalk of the heavy blossom, because it has to stay alive, to continue to the last drop of joy. The world knows the love that's in its breast as in the flower, the suffering, lonely world. The Father is merciful. The light socket is crudely attached to the ceiling after the house was built to receive a plug, which sticks in it all right and serves my phonograph now. The closet door is open for me where I left it. Since I left it open, it has graciously stayed open. The kitchen has no door. The hole there will admit me should I wish to enter the kitchen. I remember when I first got laid, HP graciously took my cherry. I sat on the docks of Provincetown, aged 23, joyful, elevated in hope with the Father. The door to the room was open to admit me if I wished to enter. There are unused electricity plugs all over my house if I ever needed them. The kitchen window is open to admit air. The telephone, sad to relate, sits on the floor. I haven't had the money to get it connected. I want people to bow when they see me and say, he is gifted with poetry. He has seen the presence of the Creator, and the Creator gave me a shot of his presence to gratify my wish so as not to cheat me of my yearning for him. It's like, whoa. So mine is related, unrelated, I don't know. I keep changing my mind about which poem to read next, but I guess I'll read this one. It's called Transitions. For Rocco. Sometimes I'm driving and I press the button to see who called, and suddenly I'm taking pictures. Big dark ones. He says it's not about where you sit to make a film, but I wasn't taking a picture, I was driving. It's black and there's all these lights. I'm strong, it's night, and I've driven very far. I keep hearing the music of the weekend. He says it's not about whether she and I resume, it's how it goes on with me. In my car so long ago, I loved someone who read me a poem on the phone about the car of the day. You mean the one I'm driving, and the fact that she left it on the phone and that was new? She said I was overreacting and that was too much, and we sent our messages in light. And she hated trees. I thought, she's so young because I like nature now, and her trunk wrapped around me one day. He licks my arm, my boy, and driving home I thought, if he dies, I will see his paw in the sky. I am seeing it now, and she's always home going, hoo-wah. And she said, I love our little meeting. I said, little? Don't denigrate my need to support, my need to say that you can. I'm glad I'm home. It's wide out there. We spoke about scaffolding, him fitting the frame to the eye. She's grown, I wanted to say. We laughed about tang, and later on the toilet thought about tango, and Joan, El Tango Larkin. What's not technology? What's not seeing? An arm to say, I hold a line, I hold the day, I watch the snowflake melting. So, God, in answer to all these questions, I guess the first thing, I had a little, okay, here. The first thing I have to say I thought about was God, because, I'm a Catholic poet, no matter what I say. I grew up in a very structured reality, and there was a whole system of weights and measures that was about time and the present and the future. And in a certain bizarre way, I was very safe in it, and I liked prayer, and I liked being Catholic, and I liked all the rituals of it. And I think, the core of it all fell away, in high school, because suddenly I didn't believe, and the whole thing seemed like an empty mechanism. And yet part of me, several things happened in that space, one of which was, the whole ordering of a reality, and the reality of being somebody who went to a Catholic school, which meant the kind of book of hours that the day was. And the thing that, I think a lot of us, at least who grew up in the 50s and 60s, where you'd eat lunch and you'd stand up and you'd recite. And you'd recite your prayers, and you'd recite your poem, and you'd recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And these three texts were just sort of stitched in together as your consciousness, and there was like a biological stitching too. They were just, like you were full, and you couldn't leave your body yet, and yet there was this text that was right on the border, and it's sort of like it transitioned you into the next space, which was the afternoon and another kind of tedium. But it marked time, and it's sort of like, and so that fact of a text, and it's funny because I'm listening, like whether we talk about syllables and whether we talk about formal form, and received forms and stuff, it's sort of like they were there. They simply were there. They were part of what language was and what the whole institutionality of one's young existence and sense of time was. And so I feel like a certain count was embedded in me, both in those texts and in the whole weight of that existence, that if I, we had, we had they called them ejaculations, i.e., my Jesus mercy, my Jesus mercy. And if you said enough of these, you were actually erasing time from purgatory, so that there was never a downtime for a Catholic child. You could always be doing a little bit of work, and kind of making space and stuff. So all of it was just, there was a kind of a metricality to the whole existence, which preceded everything, which became part of the life of being a poet. And the other thing is just a grasping for systems, which I'm crazy about, And when I first arrived in New York with this intention of being a poet, I started reaching out for texts, and I think the first one I saw was a book called Entropy by Rudolf Arnheim, and it was about entropy in art, and it was about the loss of energy and inertia, and a kind of a falling away, and it opened into the uncertainty principle, and it opened into, and all that, which was so much in the art world of New York of the 70s and 80s, and that sense of, the difference between time and space, and the sense of watching something and how it changed the nature of the experience, and later chaos, which is still probably the most formal like science, I mean, maybe part of it is sort of like being sort of a half-assed scientist, which I think a poet is in a way, or a kind of a broken mathematician, And so it's sort of like whenever I learn something about science, or same with theory, I'm a bad reader of theory, and I take broken pieces of it and start building this thing which creates a certain kind of ecstasy. There was a book called War in the Age of Intelligent Machines that everybody was reading in the 90s, and it was my introduction to Deleuze and Guattari. And it was about something called the machinic phylum, which was the order of life, which was half machine, half human, which was, we were coming into robotics, but also thinking about, what do you call it? The cell phone, anything the pencil. What's the word I'm looking? No. It is technology, but what is the word? Pardon me? Cyborg. Yes. I mean, it's like the sense that everything is a cyborg, and that cyborg is informing my poem all the time. And so it's sort of like I feel like we live in a time where it's sort of like the cyborging is endless and always new. I mean, I have such a strong sense of the 80s in New York being a moment when somebody I was sexually obsessed with was reduced to a red light blinking on an answering machine on the floor, and me standing there praying that I wouldn't pick up the phone and call her because I knew I'd be in another whole cycle of that obsession, for 6 more months. And it's sort of like that all relationships were suddenly reduced to a kind of deading, where it used to be you'd walk into your apartment, and if you had a phone, it was either ringing or not ringing. And now you would walk into your apartment and you owed 10 messages, and there's a whole different sense of being in the world with people, and it changed the very nature of time, and all those went directly into the poem, So I feel like so much of my sense of form is just the collision of those systems. I mean, I don't know if it was me or my dog was having the particular homeopathic experience that gave me the language pulse dosing, which meant that instead of, which led right into Gertrude Stein, like that because the blood is circulating, a tiny amount of something going into the system at a certain interval would keep informing the whole system. And I thought, then I want a poem to be the slightest amount of tweaking, the slightest amount of form. So just when you think this person is totally jabbering, there's a little tweak. And just the fact that tweak happens once or rhythmically in a pulse in a poem makes it be a poem, not jabbering, But it's sort of like, so I feel like I've been spending 20 or 30 years looking for, and I think one of the conversations we were having before, which it was like, just when I think I know what I'm going to say, Gabby started talking about locations. It's like, what is the poetic difference between living in New York and living in Los Angeles in the cyborg of being in a car? I remember when the poet David Trinidad moved to New York, and I remember from Los Angeles, and I remember him saying, "When do you people think?" And I didn't know what he meant until I moved to Los Angeles. And I was just in this moving tomb, which was a car, for long hours. And I was like, oh, I get it. The writer in Los Angeles has so much time to kind of consider what you was just said and think about it again. Whereas in New York, it might be the subway. It might be, like, I don't know. I mean, I can't even form the equivalent. But it's in fact, we don't. It's sort of like we're more in the Ben Haminian shock system, where it's just like, just when you thought you got it, boom, something else. You was like, oh, and it was very hard actually to come back to New York after living in California and take that back, to kind of, and be 10 years older and to kind of receive shock. And I receive shocks differently now. And I think it's funny. I've been very obsessed with translation though lately, and I am. And again, sadly, it's the idea of translation, because I think I've translated 1 or 2 little poems and thought, oh my God, this is incredible. But I don't, I have no practice of it. But I do notice, as part of my poetic survival, it seems like every decade there's a new way to interpret being a poet, so you can make a living. And that might be performance, that might be teaching, that might be journalism, that might be, and there's always, because there's always a new art form that's stylish, and curating became, like I think perhaps in the 21st century, something like the curator that each artist was becoming a curator in a way. I think in the way that pastiche is more the form of the poem than anything else now. And then likewise, I think the whole act of translation, and I think it is all these cyborgs, that we're translating all these different machines into a poem, or back and forth. And so I've been thinking a lot about, and again, I'm sort of a groupie of translators because I find them to be the most intense readers, and that they're translating a text from one body into another. And I think, did you say the echo? I mean, I think that, and I wish I had the quote from Walter Benjamin here, though I have an approximation of it, because I was looking at Anne Carson's Sappho as well, and she was talking so ecstatically about translation, and she was saying brackets, and like in translation in relationship to Sappho and what wasn't there, and that brackets excite, and she mentioned, I have some version of it here. She mentioned Benjamin's talk on translation, and he said that that the translator doesn't enter the text, but calls in and draws its echo out in his own language, And I think that's what we're doing. It's so hard to be a human being in this meta moment with so many different machines colliding with us, and us needing to completely keep picking up the new instrument and being the room. And I think finally my task as a poet is to make something, a poem is the art I make for the room I'm in, and the room itself is constantly changing. And so, I weirdly think that finally I'm doing something very old-fashioned with it, that the room might be Jackson Pollock, but I'm Morandi, And if you know his work, he was the guy that just kept painting a cup over and over and over and over again and stuff. And, I think the cup might be the self, and I'm just kind of, it's sort of like, and this is my final thought, perhaps. I guess that living here at the end of the present, I still want that most of all, is to struggle to be here, which is my struggle for God still. It's so weird, the word God that went so out of my world has come so radically back in a way, because I feel like God is what I thought at first I still think is true, which is God is what's in between everything, kind of. And when I was listening to us all read today and hearing the holes in the Sappho, which and feeling each one of us being quiet and breathing in that moment, or hearing Marilyn read, who I've not seen for years and haven't heard read for years, and thinking that your silences were better than ever. It's sort of like when the poet holds it, that cold kind of just that outpouring of words, and then that kind of holding it back, that meaty silence, which I think is the body being present and the body meeting God in some weird, crazy way. So that's what I got.
All right, people. Let us just ask, respond, reflect, marvel. I'm gonna, just because predictably we went a little over time in all of that fabulous reflection and reading that we just got as a gift from these poets, I'm gonna go straight to your questions as opposed to asking the panelists to question each other. And then we'll do that for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes, and we'll come back around to our closing reading.
Well, I really wouldn't say I'm bilingual. I wish I could say that. I understand everything in Spanish. I'm not fluent speaking, but I understand everything. But Spanish does enter my poems, I think, when it just so happens. And with this book, of course, it really, I think, would have been a problem not to have some of the passages or just have both languages in the poem. But I think you're right that there's just something that's always lost that way. So if you write in one language or you're monolingual, then right there's an emptiness or loss for a language that we don't know, which we all have, right? Everybody in the world, right, sort of has that emptiness in them. If you're completely bilingual, then you have access, I think, to a whole other world in a way that the rest of us don't. And then I just think there are degrees. But I think there's always a loss, and there's always maybe even some degree of irresponsibility in adopting a language that I'm not completely fluent in a poem. So that's the way I'd answer that. It's an imperfect practice, I think. And I envy those who are bilingual, trilingual, because they just have more access to more of the world. But in some ways, I just kind of honor what seems right and, trust that it's not so much of an offense that I'm not completely fluent.
I would say to your question that, a poet's vision is bilingual. And what perhaps you are addressing to me is the problematic of representation, which is a process of translation, as everything else is, but in particular when you are othering someone else for aesthetic purposes or non-aesthetic purposes, then you are performing an act of representation and translation to perform that. And I agree that it is a bit problematic perhaps to make those choices when it comes to co-opting the suffering of others and wanting to be witness to it. And I don't think that we sort of, the end of the conversation will be, well, it's better to witness than not to witness. From my experience as a physician or, in certain places or not certain places, I think it is, I do it, but I realize that it is in part my dramatic self that is just also, that is also that also benefits from this. So, the ethics of the questions of representation and translation, I think, are endless, perhaps. But
I would say that that seems like an incredible experience of translation. I think because I think work is as aspirational as you could belong to a community, or you can find a poem that is attached to a community, and it's your way of saying, I want to be that community. I want to. But also, like when I think about my own experience, like taking something like New York School poetry or language poetry and bringing it into a lesbian culture that may not know that work. It's sort of like my collision with Sisters bit, I thought was bringing New York School into kind of a dyke community. Not that they didn't have access to Frank O'Hara, but maybe not, and it's sort of like, so a lot of what happens, I think, is when you move into, and I was there for, and you're there because of other needs, so there's this endless completion of yourself personally that is kind of, and that forms a new community, and then that work attracts, because I think work is always magnetic, and it becomes a sticky thing that draws other people in too. So I think it's an endless process of community making that's an aesthetic result.
And I wonder if what degree of self-censorship enters into the concept of translation or the process of translation regarding community. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, as someone who's of Palestinian heritage, translating Darwish or translating other Arabic poetries, and so you just wonder what kind of diction, if you will, do you introduce the poems in, and why would you do that? And obviously, in translation, the question is open-ended. You can do it in any diction you want. And the question is, are you? The question becomes also, speaking of Deleuze, a question of peripheries. Are you introducing this community to simply have a presence on the periphery, or do you want the periphery to push in on the center? And and these are bizarre thoughts, because they really are in sort of like Deep Space Nine kind of thing.
Well, I think so much. One of the great things about being a poet, it seems to me, or one of the best lessons I learned early, and I think this happens in lots of kinds of genres, but I think specifically with poetry, and I think very much of hip hop in this way, so we're constantly talking to each other and referencing each other, even when we aren't, right, and even when we aren't specifically saying it. So if I'm working on a pantoum, for instance, whether or not I know it, whether or not I knew it when I was first starting to write pantoums, and maybe that's why I got, if one can call something better, or things got more difficult for me, was I became aware that I was really in a constant conversation with all kinds of people I agreed with and people I didn't agree with. And I think that that's also really important when we think about form, and I think this is what this idea of margins is really important, is the community that you're speaking to, and then how form can do this remarkable thing of you hit like the limit of your possibility, right? And like the way it seems to me that one can push upon a form past that sort of limit that you hit is to think like, how do I move past what I know of that form? And also, I think for some of us, you think about like a poem like A Lovely Love by Gwendolyn Brooks, like you think about the sonnet and a certain kind of form as a wall, and then you think about what does it mean to move past that wall and through that wall, and how then that is when the form becomes fluid and alive again, and that's how form can spring like a virus, I mean, you can catch it.
I also wonder about the question of communities, and obviously it means a lot to me and so forth, but it's not a secret that we're in a moment where the delta of art, our art and aesthetic variance and variability is really become a delta and more maybe a C. And I don't know if we really know what to make of that. And we don't have a precedent in human history for that, and maybe that's a good thing. And I was thinking the other day about trying to draw what we know about evolution into this. So the idea of natural selection, then there's adaptation, and then there is a spandrel process of sub-adaptation and acceptation and so forth. The whole idea of the bud wing, that animals adapted it for temperature regulation. That was natural selection. And then after a while, adaptation made that into a wing, and then, so if we think of the history of human poetics with that little parallel, then if we are at the stage of the wing, then where is that wing going to go? Because the idea of evolution or adaptation and its sub-processes is still going on. So because of consciousness always coming onto things, then I really don't know. Sometimes I'm frozen, about that moment. Speaking of what you said about things that have existed already, I'm working on a poem whose title is Elegy for Neurotransmitters, because it always fascinates me that dreams, we don't understand dreams, what their function is, and so forth. So neurotransmitters have always existed. We haven't known about them. Once we know about them, which is consciousness, we try to influence meaning, and we think that consciousness is actually some pure thing. So anyway.
Will anybody admit to be writing in persona? I'm not sure it's not a dirty word at this moment in time.
Well, I am.
Yeah?
I talked about it.
You're a dirty guy.
I talked a little bit about when I went to her queer poetics class. I'm actually working on a piece about Anne Boleyn. I went to the Tower of London New Year's Eve, I guess it was, and I've been fascinated, and I'm trying to find a way to express my sense of her. And so far it's coming out in first person, but I have to say I'm still a little bit mistrustful of that, and wondering if there are other ways that I can bring in third person or other things in terms of creating her on the page. And one of the things that I realized, in my new cycle, since I write in cycles, I'm working on a piece about Lorca, but it's in third person. but sometimes they're first-person voices that are Lorca and the people who killed him, the men who killed him. But also just this idea I was talking about in class was a walk with this person in history, a different relationship to historical figures. You know, my sense of history, I feel like I should be able to identify with anyone who ever walked the earth somehow. And fortunately, because I'm also a professional actor, I feel like I can bypass some of the usual restrictions against trying to like get into someone's shoes or figure out what their dynamic is. So I think there's no easy way. One person to go to, of course, was the late poet Ai, because she spent her whole career essentially writing persona poems. And one of the mysteries of her writing is that so often she wrote in male personae, and she did it so effectively. So I don't think there's any easy way. I mean, if you have those impulses, which I do, you just have to kind of follow them and trust that. Well, be honest about putting on the mask, that there's a purpose to putting on the mask. And it often takes a while to figure out why this particular person and why the story. But eventually it catches up with you as a mirror, I find. Like I also talked about, I got obsessed with Van Gogh at some point. I was looking at a painting of his in the Musée d'Orsay, and I got a really strong sense of the field where he killed himself. And since it was Y2K, and Paris had the most beautiful, spectacular celebration in the world, my first thought was like, oh, depressive thought in the middle of all of this. I don't want to go there. But eventually I realized there was something for me to pursue, so that I literally went to the field where he shot himself, right? Because I just knew that there was something important about the field. And how some of this got confirmed for me is that, remember Sister Wendy, the art nun? She did a whole section on Van Gogh, and she ended the section, she stood in the field and she started weeping. She said, nothing has made me feel the intensity of his struggle with depression and art than standing in this field. And I started crying too. I thought, that's exactly what I felt when I looked at the painting. It just rolled into me. And like I say, sometimes we just get our homework assignment. And you have to be kind of game or willing to go and find out what that emotion in that moment is. And sometimes it means like, making the pilgrimage like I talked about, or putting on the mask. And part of the process for me eventually was that I realized it wasn't just about Van Gogh, it was also about Vincent's relationship to his brother Theo. Because I realized I was in a Theo position. I didn't understand my brother's mental illness until it was like that. And I thought, oh, that's part of the reason for my Van Gogh odyssey. So sometimes like putting on the mask and doing the persona work will lead you to epiphany, I want to say.
I think I should speak up just because I was the person who resisted the term. I mean, when I hear persona, I go, and I think what it is that I think more in terms of a rhythm, and that I think of, I guess, Gertrude Stein talking about portraits and repetitions and how every personality is a series of repetitions. And so anytime I've had the experience where I wanted to write about a body of information or a history or a personage, it seemed like the way to do it was to keep returning to the material and reading it obsessively until you found a rhythm that animated, so that it's sort of like the character started to walk, so that you don't have a poem that goes, and the tower was cold.
That's
we want to be in the fucking
you're
tower.
You're so right, because that's my experience now. The rhythms of these two poems are completely different from anything else I've ever written.
And until you find them, you're just not moving.
I've been excited, and I've just been writing these poems in the last 2 months, and it's like the rhythm is completely different. It's like, I'm on to something, I know I am. Mm-hmm. But you're right, it has a lot to do with rhythm, and feeling like this is the right rhythm for this person and story and this history.
Which I think is what an actor goes through.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's very subtle. You're right.
I'm curious. Is there such a thing as a poet who writes without this persona thing? So I'm sometimes wondering about these terms, like why.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think it is about rhythm and all of these things, because to me it's about intimacy. And I started in the I started writing persona for probably the most boring and maybe the most common reason, which is that I thought I was never going to stop writing about my mother killing herself, and I probably will not. So I was writing these poems, which were like, I mean, I think really well meant, and some of the worst poems written in the English language. And you know, I mean, I was walking into the water with me and Virginia Woolf, holding hands with rocks in our pockets. Like, we were doing a lot of things. I mean, really horrifying things. And more importantly than that, I wasn't surprising myself anymore. And I was lucky enough at that point to start studying with Richard Howard and studying with Lucy Brock-Boideau. And the poem that actually brought me to persona, whether or not we think of it as a persona poem, was actually Cavafy's The City, where Lucy Brock-Boideau gave me this and said, go home and do that, you know? And then that kind of laying things bare and truth-telling, but also this incredible sense of intimacy that you could get by, like, if you and I look each other in the eye the whole time that I'm telling you something, right? And like the moment that I feel like I have to look away, that's an incredible moment of charge between us. And for me, I began to think about writing persona poems as not so much telling the story of figures we already knew, but how could I go to those stories that clearly had a Circus Fire or Amelia Earhart or, you know, whatever, that had a kind of charge for me, and how could I find the space on our bodies, like where we were fused like Siamese twins, you know? And very often that space wasn't like, oh, she got lost and we couldn't find her anymore, you know? Like, that space became, well, what if like you were some, you know, housewife in some marriage that like wasn't working, and there's this, like, you're listening on the radio about this person who disappears, and it would be really nice to disappear sometimes, you know? And I often tell my students, it's fine if you want to write to me about, like, if you want to write for me in the voice of Eve, that's fine. But I don't really want to know about the apple so much as I want to know about, like, what does this part of Adam's neck smell like? You know what I mean? Like, what's that like to watch, like, the way sweat pools on, like, the small of his back? And so for me, persona was a space where I could come into the most intimate and shocking parts of myself, and recognize that maybe I was going to tell the same story all the time, but I needed to find ways to enter it in different ways for myself. Is that sometimes I say things that are not clear? No. Okay.
No, that was incredible.
One thing I'd say about that is the trouble you can get in with a persona poem is if there's any sort of sense that you actually are writing as if you're that person, right? I mean, it needs to be somehow clear that that's really not the impulse, because that's impossible. I mean, I think a kind of voluntary displacement is a good thing. And I think that writing persona poems is, all of us, I think, in our lifetimes have felt that displacement. I always tell the story. I lived in southern Africa for 3 years in Swaziland. I taught in the rural schools there. And no amount of explaining to the Swazis that I was brown in this country said to them, I was white. And for 3 years, everything that gets projected positively or negatively on a white person was projected on me. And I have never felt white. I've never defined myself as white. And it was one of the deepest, most profound learning experiences for me, that 3 years. I learned more. I tell people I went there feeling like I was somewhat progressive about race and realized I was an infant. And so the thing about a persona poem, if you want to call that, is that it is, and you sort of mentioned it, there's a lot to be learned in the kind of, in the sort of boldness with humility of trying to imagine somebody from the inside out. It's not, we are never that person, right? And I think when there's been controversy over persona poems, it's a very delicate thing, because I think it has to do with tone. Right? And so you get upset when you think the person's sort of saying this is what it's like, rather than an exploration of that displacement. And I mean, displacement is usually a painful thing, but every concept has its continuum if you look at it differently. And displacement can be, I think, a very, very valuable experience, whether it's in a poem or in real life, if it doesn't kill you. And oftentimes it's torturous and kills you, right? So it's complicated. But in some ways, I don't know how we learn empathy and compassion if we don't spend a little bit of time, right, trying to imagine in our conversations or a meeting or encounters or our witnessing of something. If there is no ability to or empathic desire to feel what somebody else feels, doesn't mean we are that person. But it does open up a channel, hopefully, of kind of understanding or feeling that to me is the only saving grace that we have in this world. I mean, when I talk about each and her, I say it's a love poem. It's brutal in places, but it's a love poem. And so that's the only way I believe, right? We sort of go on the journey toward making a difference, is you have to imagine what somebody is completely different than yourself, or wherever on that continuum, what their experience is like. We're not them, but the road to trying to understand that, I think, is a very, very important and necessary path for all of us, as hard as it can be. July in Central Juarez. The station wagon quits every third block. Amalia, mother, haggle with the men for an engine fix. Stay in the car and lock the doors. We huddled tight, sister blouses damp in the heat. Crush of men, fingers through the window cracks. Their smears on the glass. Is there no way to avoid the cliches? Woman, flower, man, monger, fear, fever, control? In the desert of Lote Bravo, 2 teenage boys and their dogs follow a trail in scraps of women's clothes. The best way to manage the disease is by inspection and sanitation. Remove faded or blighted flowers, blighted leaves, or entire plants infected at the base. Out of snow dust and winter brown, the serpentine Rio Grande, rectangular squat of Buttiger's bar, where, trying to leave, he pulled his fist back, slammed it into your face. A single mass murderer, copycat homicides, 2 or 3 serial killers, Maki bus drivers, 5 called Los Choferes, members of a satanic cult, organ harvesters, federal agents and police officers, killing parties linked to the drug cartels, more than 50 suspects in custody with no effect on the murder activity. Aphids, tiny pear-shaped insects that suck plant juices, preferring new growth. Beetles, hard-shelled insects that feed mostly on leaves and flowers. Borers, beetle or moth larvae that bore into cane. Downy mildew, a fungus appearing as white to grayish fuzz on the undersides of leaves. Sometimes when you cross a shipment of drugs into the United States, adrenaline is so high that you want to celebrate by killing women. Sígame. February 27th. Carefully cut away the infected plant parts, then prune 4 of 6 bushes, according to instructions. May 5th. 1 unpruned barely survives. Another produces healthy leaves but no flowers. 2 well-pruned flower abundantly in quick wilting roses. 2 also well-pruned bloom and bloom, keep blooming, relentless. With proper care, your rose bushes will enjoy 4, even 5 blooming cycles. Keep cutting, keep them blooming. Julia Caldera would not believe that her daughter, Maria Elena, had been murdered. For 4 years, she held to the belief that a rich man from the United States had fallen in love with Maria, taken her across the international border, and given her a much better life. In the first instance, a prelude to multiple scenes in hospital rooms, you sleep drugged and drunk on Highway 64, a quarter-mile past the Taos Gorge Bridge. Your plans to leap foiled by a cocktail of vodka and Prozac. In the third, you step into a moving car. Concussion, broken collarbone, lacerated liver, right leg shattered in 3 places. I hold to the railings of the bed, knuckles blue-white, willing my legs to stay solid. No sígame. July 10th. I dream rose vines shouldered by women in a ship's hold, like those cankerem drawings, Romans in rows heaving their giant oars. Vines studded with dollar bills and Mexican coins, pricks on their necks like stigmata. Through the apertures, not ocean, but desert, a riverbed utterly dry. July 11th. I tend the barren rose bush, crushed by a tangle of grapevines. I cut away the clinging tendrils, choking leaves, dead gray canes. Little left but a huddled knot. July 29th. In the cool dark, I find it. One new cane, caterpillar green, stunned with 2 pale pink blooms. I refuse.
I'm going to read a poem called Pantoum Evangel, Billy Sunday. And Billy Sunday was an evangelical preacher and also a professional baseball player. But he was one of these preachers who would be on the airwaves in the 30s. And this did come out of, I could not figure out how to write a pantoum. And then I thought, what I'll do is I'll write the longest pantoum possible. And so it could be the worst poem ever. I feel like every day I should try something that fails or has the possibility of failing. Pantoum Evangel, Billy Sunday. On summer nights, we'd listen to him preach. God loves you, and God will cut you down. Who knew one man could watch over us from our radio's dark corners, could hear us pray for God to love us, to cut our urges down to a size we could manage. And he played baseball. Who knew one man could watch over his glove and see a girl whittled down to a size he could manage? And he played till the dark came. I lived in Weathersfield. Was his glove, was his guile whittled down to the size of a mole's claw? I burrowed till the dark came. I lived in Weathersfield, loved the fishmonger's son, his zipper near to the size of a mole's claw. I burrowed like rats in leaching fields, mouth full of earth. Near the fishmonger's son, his zipper near, nearer my God to thee, a song he'd sing like a frog in a leaching field, its mouth, we'd hear it coming through. Nearer, my God, to thee, a song he'd sing. We couldn't make out the song's words because of the spirit. We'd hear our coming through all of that static and our mother's prayers. We couldn't make out the song's words because of my moaning. I couldn't be quiet amidst all that static. Our mothers prayed like the crowds at the Beehive, our minor league park. Of my moaning, I couldn't be quiet any more than the Red Sox could win one. For the crowds at Beehive Minor League Park, I can't explain the lure of salvation any more than the Red Sox could win one. I fell to my knees in the back of our house. I can't explain the lure of salvation, how he shook as I held him in my mouth. I fell to my knees in the back of our house as swans came up from our still pond to see how he shook as I held him in my mouth. I was like a town on Sunday morning. As swans came up from our still pond to see the lawns empty, but for one on his knees, I was like a town on Sunday morning. Was the empty square, was the parable, the lawns empty, but for one on his knees, and the girl who brought him there to be watched. Was the empty square the parable, or were the swans who tensed and chuffed their wings, and the girl who brought him there to be watched by anyone who opened their window, or the swans who tensed and chuffed their wings? Where did she think this would leave her but lost? Anyone who opened their window could see we looked nothing like rapture. I ask, where did I think this would leave me but lost as a salesman selling Bibles in church? See, we look nothing like rapture. I asked him to be gentle. He cried at the end like a salesman selling Bibles in church. What have I done? I am done for. Please tell him to be gentle. He cried at the end and hid himself from me. Billy Sunday asked, what have you done? You are done for. Please tell me again how it ended. The swans left and hid themselves from me. Billy Sunday asked if I bathed in the blood of the Lamb. Show me again how it ended. The swans hissed. In the darkness, I listened to them preach.
I'm going to read one poem from the book that's coming out, the World War II book. And it was inspired by Kata Kollwitz's art that I saw in Berlin and in Cologne. It's called A Great Beauty. And when her son never returned from the meant to crush him camps, the crucible of Poland, always hard at work, Isa slept for endless hours. And once, under her lids, she was led by diligent female Virgils to a vast meadow where an inspirited Isa embraced, one by one, countless women who remained in mourning for their cherished sons. Gallant and stricken, together the myriad bereaved but defiant women formed an ever-widening circle, prodigal with bitter tears. And then suddenly, like a jackdaw darting from eve to sun-drenched eve, something flew between the throats of the grieving, heart-gutted mothers, and a great beauty arose. In the dream, Isa recalled, the singing of the harrowed women with war-taken sons hushed the world's barrenness. In the dream, the startling river of sound altered the embattled earth.